Dedication and Introductory of Narrative of My Captivity among the Sioux Indians. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narrative of My Captivity among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. Dedication. To the officers and soldiers of the 11th Ohio Cavalry, for their persistent and daring efforts to aid my husband in effecting my rescue, and to the officers and soldiers of the 6th Iowa Cavalry, for kindness shown me after my ransom and return to Fort Sully, this narrative is affectionately dedicated by the author. Introductory. The summer of 1864 marked a period of unusual peril to the daring pioneers seeking homes in the far West. Following upon the horrible massacres in Minnesota in 1862, and the subsequent chastisements inflicted by the expeditions under Generals Sully and Sibley in 1863, whereby the Indians were driven from the then western borders of civilization in Iowa, Minnesota, and the white settlements of Dakota, in the Missouri Valley the great immigrant trails to Idaho and Montana became the scene of fresh outrages, and, from the wild, almost inaccessible nature of the country, pursuit and punishment were impossible. I was a member of a small company of emigrants, who were attacked by an overwhelming force of hostile Sioux, which resulted in the death of a large proportion of the party, in my own capture, and a horrible captivity of 5 months' duration. Of my thrilling adventures and experience during this season of terror and privation, I propose to give a plain, unvarnished narrative, hoping the reader will be more interested in facts concerning the habits, manners, and customs of the Indians, and their treatment of prisoners, than in theoretical speculations and fine-wrought sentences. Some explanation is due the public for the delay in publishing this my narrative. From memoranda kept during the period of my captivity, I had completed the work for publication, when the manuscript was purloined and published, but the work was suppressed before it could be placed before the public. After surmounting many obstacles, I have at last succeeded in gathering the scattered fragments, and, by the aid of memory, impressed as I pray no mortals may ever be again, am enabled to place the results before, I trust, a kind judging, appreciative public. End of dedication and introductory. Chapter 1 of Narrative of My Captivity among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Early history. Canada to Kansas. Death of my father. My marriage. Ho for Idaho. Crossing the Platte River. A storm. I was born in Orillia, Canada, in 1845. Our home was on the lake shore, and there amid pleasant surroundings I passed the happy days of early childhood. The years 1852 to 1856 witnessed, probably, the heaviest immigration the West has ever known in a corresponding length of time. Those who had gone before sent back to their friends such marvelous accounts of the fertility of the soil, the rapid development of the country, and the ease with which fortunes were made, the Western fever became almost epidemic. Whole towns in the old Eastern states were almost depopulated. Old substantial farmers, surrounded apparently by all the comforts that heart could wish, sacrificed the homes wherein their families had been reared for generations, and, with all their worldly possessions, turned their faces toward the setting sun. And with what high hopes! Alas, how few comparatively met their realization! In 1856, my father, James Wiggins, joined a New York colony bound for Kansas. Being favorably impressed with the country and its people, they located the town of Geneva, and my father returned for his family. Reaching the Missouri River on our way to our new home, my father was attacked with cholera and died. In obedience to his dying instructions, my widowed mother, with her little family, continued on the way to our new home. But oh, with what saddened hearts we entered into its possession! It seemed as if the light of our life had gone out. He who had been before to prepare that home for us was not there to share it with us, and, far away from all earthly associations, almost alone in a new and sparsely settled country, it seemed as though hope had died. But God is merciful. He prepares the soul for its burdens. Of a truth, He tempers the wind to the shorn lamb. Our family remained in this pleasant prairie home, where I was married to Josiah S. Kelly. My husband's health failing, he resolved upon a change of climate. Accordingly, on the 17th of May, 1864, a party of 6 persons, including Mr. Gardner Wakefield, my husband, myself, our adopted daughter, my sister's child, and 2 colored servants, started from Geneva, with high-wrought hopes and pleasant anticipations of a romantic and delightful journey across the plains, and a confident expectation of future prosperity among the golden hills of Idaho. A few days after commencing our journey, we were joined by Mr. Sharp, a Methodist clergyman, from Verdigris River, about 30 miles south of Geneva, and, a few weeks later, we overtook a large train of emigrants, among whom were a family from Allen County, with whom we were acquainted: Mr. Larimer, wife, and a child, a boy 8 years old. Preferring to travel with our small train, they left the larger one, and became members of our party. The addition of one of my own sex to our little company was cause of much rejoicing to me, and helped relieve the dullness of our tiresome march. The hours of noon and evening rest were spent in preparing our frugal meals, gathering flowers with our children, picking berries, hunting curiosities, or gazing in rapt wonder and admiration at the beauties of this strange, bewildering country. Our amusements were varied. Singing, reading, writing to friends at home, or pleasant conversation occupied our leisure hours. So passed the first few happy days of our emigration to the land of sunshine and flowers. When the sun had set, when his last rays were flecking the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains, gathering around campfires in our little home-like tent, we ate with a relish known only to those who, like us, scented the pure air, and lived as nature demanded. At night, when our camp had been arranged by Andy and Franklin, our colored men, it was always in the same relative position, Mr. Kelly riding a few miles ahead as evening drew near to select the camping ground. The atmosphere, which during the day was hot and stifling, became cool, and was laden with the odor of prairie flowers, the night dews filling their beautiful cups with the waters of heaven. The solemnity of night pervaded everything. The warblings of the feathered tribe had ceased. The antelope and deer rested on the hills. No sound of laughing, noisy children, as in a settled country. No tramping of busy feet, or hurrying to and fro. All is silent. Nature, like men, has put aside the labors of the day, and is enjoying rest and peace. Yonder, as a tiny spark, as a distant star, might be seen from the road a little campfire in the darkness spread over the earth. Every eye in our little company is closed, every hand still, as we lay in our snugly covered wagons, awaiting the dawn of another day. And the eye that never sleeps watched over us in our lonely camp, and cared for the slumbering travelers. Mr. Wakefield, with whom we became acquainted after he came to settle at Geneva, proved a most agreeable companion. Affable and courteous, unselfish, and a gentleman, we remember him with profound respect. A fine bridge crosses the Kansas River. A half-hour's ride through the dense heavy timber, over a jet-black soil of incalculable richness, brought us to this bridge, which we crossed. We then beheld the lovely valley of the prairies, intersecting the deep green of graceful slopes, where waves tall prairie grass, among which the wild flowers grow. Over hundreds of acres these blossoms are scattered, yellow, purple, white, and blue, making the earth look like a rich carpet of variegated colors. Those blooming in the spring are of tender, modest hue, in later summer and early autumn, clothed in gorgeous splendor. Solomon's gold and purple could not outrival them. Nature seemingly reveled in beauty for beauty's sake alone, for none but the simple children of the forest to view her in state. Slowly the myriad years come and go upon her solitary places. Tender springtime and glorious summer drop down their gifts from overflowing coffers, while the steps of bounding deer or the notes of singing birds break upon the lonely air. The sky is of wonderful clearness and transparency. Narrow belts and fringes of forest mark the way of winding streams. In the distance rise conical mounds, wrapped in the soft veil of dim and dreary haze. Upon the beaten road are emigrants wending their way, their household goods packed in long covered wagons, drawn by oxen, mules, or horses; speculators working their way to some new town with women and children; and we meet with half-breed girls, with heavy eyelashes and sunburned cheeks, jogging along on horseback. I was surprised to see so many women among the emigrants, and to see how easily they adapted themselves to the hardships experienced in a journey across the plains. As a rule, the emigrants travel without tents, sleeping in and under wagons, without removing their clothing. Cooking among the emigrants to the far west is a very primitive operation, a frying pan and perhaps a Dutch oven comprising the major part of the kitchen furniture. The scarcity of timber is a source of great inconvenience and discomfort, buffalo chips being the substitute. At some of the stations, where opportunity offered, Mr. Kelly bought wood by the pound, as I had not yet been long enough inured to plains privations to relish food cooked over a fire made with chips of that kind. We crossed the Platte River by joining 4 wagon boxes together, then loaded the boat with goods, and were rowed across by about 20 men. We were several days in crossing. Our cattle and horses swam across. The air had been heavy and oppressively hot. Now the sky began to darken suddenly, and just as we reached the opposite shore, a gleam of lightning, like a forked tongue of flame, shot out of the black clouds, blinding us by its flash, and followed by a frightful crash of thunder. Another gleam and another crash followed, and the dense blackness lowered threateningly over us, almost shutting out the heights beyond, and seeming to encircle us like prisoners in the valley that lay at our feet. The vivid flashes lighting the darkness for an instant only made its gloom more fearful, and the heavy rolling of the thunder seemed almost to rend the heavens above it. All at once it burst upon our unprotected heads in rain. But such rain! Not the gentle droppings of an afternoon shower, or a commonplace storm, but a sweeping avalanche of water, drenching us completely at the first dash, and continuing to pour, seeming to threaten the earth on which we stood, and tempt the old Platte to rise and claim it as its own. Our wagon covers had been removed in the fording, and we had no time to put up tents for our protection until its fury was exhausted, and so we were forced to brave the elements, with part of our company on the other side of the swollen river, and a wild scene we could hardly discern through the pelting rain surrounding us. One soon becomes heroic in an open-air life, and so we put up what shelter we could when the abating storm gave us opportunity, and, wringing the water out of clothes, hair, and eyebrows, we camped in cheerful hope of a bright tomorrow, which did not disappoint us, and our hundreds of emigrant companions scattered on the way. Each recurring Sabbath was gratefully hailed as a season of thought and repose. As a matter of conscience and duty we observed the day, and took pleasure in doing so. We had divine service performed, observing the ceremonies of prayer, preaching, and singing, which was fully appreciated in our absence from home and its religious privileges. 25 miles from California Crossing is a place called Ash Hollow, where the eye is lost in space as it endeavors to penetrate its depths. Here some years before, General Harney made his name famous by an indiscriminate massacre of a band of hostile Indians, with their women and children. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Narrative of My Captivity among the Sioux Indians, by Fanny Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. THE ATTACK AND THE CAPTURE. A train of wagons were coursing their westward way, with visions of the future bright as our own. Sometimes a single team might be seen traveling alone. Our party were among the many small squads emigrating to the land of promise. The day on which our doomed family were scattered and killed was the 12th of July, a warm and oppressive day. The burning sun poured forth its hottest rays upon the great Black Hills and the vast plains of Montana, and the great emigrant road was strewed with men, women, and children, and flocks of cattle, representing towns of adventurers. We looked anxiously forward to the approach of evening, with a sense of relief after the excessive heat of the day. Our journey had been pleasant, but toilsome, for we had been long weeks on the road. Slowly our wagons wound through the timber that skirted the little box elder, and, crossing the stream, we ascended the opposite bank. We had no thought of danger or timid misgivings on the subject of savages, for our fears had been all dispelled by constantly received assurances of their friendliness. At the outposts and ranches we heard nothing but ridicule of their pretensions to warfare, and at Fort Laramie, where information that should have been reliable was given us, we had renewed assurances of the safety of the road and friendliness of the Indians. At Horseshoe Creek, which we had just left, and where there was a telegraph station, our inquiries had elicited similar assurances as to the quiet and peaceful state of the country through which we must pass. Being thus persuaded that fears were groundless, we entertained none, and, as I have mentioned before, our small party preferred to travel alone on account of the greater progress made in that way. The beauty of the sunset and the scenery around us filled our hearts with joy, and Mr. Wakefield's voice was heard in song for the last time, as he sang, "Ho, for Idaho!" Little Mary's low, sweet voice, too, joined in the chorus. She was so happy in her childish glee on that day, as she always was. She was the star and joy of our whole party. We wended our way peacefully and cheerfully on, without a thought of the danger that was lying like a tiger in ambush on our path. Without a sound of preparation or a word of warning, the bluffs before us were covered with a party of about 250 Indians, painted and equipped for war, who uttered the wild war whoop and fired a signal volley of guns and revolvers into the air. This terrible and unexpected apparition came upon us with such startling swiftness that we had not time to think before the main body halted and sent out a part of their force, which encircled us round at regular intervals, but some distance from our wagons. Recovering from the shock, our men instantly resolved on defense, and corralled the wagons. My husband was looked upon as leader, as he was principal owner of the train. Without regard to the insignificance of our numbers, Mr. Kelly was ready to stand his ground, but, with all the power I could command, I entreated him to forbear and only attempt conciliation. "If you fire one shot," I said, "I feel sure you will seal our fate, as they seem to outnumber us 10 to 1, and will at once massacre all of us." Love for the trembling little girl at my side, my husband, my friends, made me strong to protest against anything that would lessen our chance for escape with our lives. Poor little Mary! From the first she had entertained an ungovernable dread of the Indians, a repugnance that could not be overcome, although in our intercourse with friendly savages I had endeavored to show how unfounded it was, and persuade her that they were civil and harmless, but all in vain. Mr. Kelly bought her beads and many little presents from them, which she much admired, but she would always add, "They look so cross at me, and they have knives and tomahawks, and I fear they will kill me." Could it be that her tender young mind had some presentiment or warning of her horrid fate? My husband advanced to meet the chief and demand his intentions. The savage leader immediately came toward him, riding forward and uttering the words, "How, how," which are understood to mean a friendly salutation. His name was Ottawa, and he was a war chief of the Ogallala band of the Sioux nation. He struck himself on his breast, saying, "Good Indian me," and pointing to those around him, he continued, "Heap good Indian, hunt buffalo and deer." He assured us of his utmost friendship for the white people. Then he shook hands, and his band followed his example, crowding around our wagons, shaking us all by the hand over and over again, until our arms ached, and grinning and nodding with every demonstration of good will. Our only policy seemed to be temporizing, in hope of assistance approaching, and, to gain time, we allowed them unopposed to do whatever they fancied. First, they said they would like to change one of their horses for the one Mr. Kelly was riding, a favorite race horse. Very much against his will, he acceded to their request, and gave up to them the noble animal to which he was fondly attached. My husband came to me with words of cheer and hope, but oh, what a marked look of despair was upon his face, such as I had never seen before. The Indians asked for flour, and we gave them what they wanted of provisions. The flour they emptied upon the ground, saving only the sack. They talked to us partly by signs and partly in broken English, with which some of them were quite familiar, and as we were anxious to suit ourselves to their whims and preserve a friendly intercourse as long as possible, we allowed them to take whatever they desired, and offered them many presents besides. It was, as I have said before, extremely warm weather, but they remarked that the cold made it necessary for them to look for clothing, and begged for some of our stock, which was granted without the slightest offered objection on our part. I, in a careless like manner, said they must give me some moccasins for some articles of clothing that I had just handed them, and very pleasantly a young Indian gave me a nice pair, richly embroidered with different colored beads. Our anxiety to conciliate them increased every moment, for the hope of help arriving from some quarter grew stronger as they dallied, and alas, it was our only one. They grew bolder and more insolent in their advances. One of them laid hold of my husband's gun, but being repulsed, desisted. The chief at last intimated that he desired us to proceed on our way, promising that we should not be molested. We obeyed, without trusting them, and soon the train was again in motion, the Indians insisting on driving our herd and growing ominously familiar. Soon my husband called a halt. He saw that we were approaching a rocky glen, in whose gloomy depths he anticipated a murderous attack, and from which escape would be utterly impossible. Our enemies urged us still forward, but we resolutely refused to stir, when they requested that we should prepare supper, which they said they would share with us, and then go to the hills to sleep. The men of our party concluded it best to give them a feast. Mr. Kelly gave orders to our 2 colored servants to prepare at once to make a feast for the Indians. Andy said, "I think, if I knows anything about it, they's had their supper," as they had been eating sugar crackers from our wagons for an hour or more. The 2 colored men had been slaves among the Cherokees, and knew the Indian character by experience. Their fear and horror of them was unbounded, and their terror seemed pitiable to us, as they had worked for us a long time, and were most faithful, trustworthy servants. Each man was busy preparing the supper. Mr. Larimer and Frank were making the fire. Mr. Wakefield was getting provisions out of the wagon. Mr. Taylor was attending to his team. Mr. Kelly and Andy were out some distance gathering wood. Mr. Sharp was distributing sugar among the Indians. Supper, that they asked for, was in rapid progress of preparation, when suddenly our terrible enemies threw off their masks and displayed their truly demoniac natures. There was a simultaneous discharge of arms, and when the cloud of smoke cleared away, I could see the retreating form of Mr. Larimer and the slow motion of poor Mr. Wakefield, for he was mortally wounded. Mr. Kelly and Andy made a miraculous escape with their lives. Mr. Sharp was killed within a few feet of me. Mr. Taylor, I can never forget his face as I saw him shot through the forehead with a rifle ball. He looked at me as he fell backward to the ground, a corpse. I was the last object that met his dying gaze. Our poor faithful Frank fell at my feet pierced by many arrows. I recall the scene with a sickening horror. I could not see my husband anywhere, and did not know his fate, but feared and trembled. With a glance at my surroundings, my senses seemed gone for a time, but I could only live and endure. I had but little time for thought, for the Indians quickly sprang into our wagons, tearing off covers, breaking, crushing, smashing all hindrances to plunder, breaking open locks, trunks, and boxes, and distributing or destroying our goods with great rapidity, using their tomahawks to pry open boxes, which they split up in savage recklessness. Oh, what horrible sights met my view! Pen is powerless to portray the scenes occurring around me. They filled the air with the fearful war whoops and hideous shouts. I endeavored to keep my fears quiet as possible, knowing that an indiscreet act on my part might result in jeopardizing our lives, though I felt certain that we two helpless women would share death by their hands. But with as much of an air of indifference as I could command, I kept still, hoping to prolong our lives, even if but a few moments. I was not allowed this quiet but a moment, when two of the most savage-looking of the party rushed up to my wagon, with tomahawks drawn in their right hands, and with their left hand seized me by both hands and pulled me violently to the ground, injuring my limbs very severely, almost breaking them, from the effects of which I afterwards suffered a great deal. I turned to my little Mary, who with outstretched hands was standing in the wagon, took her in my arms, and helped her to the ground. I then turned to the chief, put my hand upon his arm, and implored his protection for my fellow prisoner and our children. At first he gave me no hope, but seemed utterly indifferent to my prayers. Partly in words and partly by signs, he ordered me to remain quiet, placing his hand on his revolver that hung in a belt at his side, as an argument to enforce obedience. A short distance in the rear of our train, a wagon was in sight. The chief immediately dispatched a detachment of his band to capture or to cut it off from us, and I saw them ride furiously off in pursuit of the small party, which consisted only of one family and a man who rode in advance of the single wagon. The horseman was almost instantly surrounded and killed by a volley of arrows. The husband of the family quickly turned his team around and started them at full speed, gave the whip and lines to his wife, who held close in her arms their youngest child. He then went to the back end of his wagon and threw out boxes, trunks, everything that he possessed. His wife, meantime, gave all her mind and strength to urging the horses forward on their flight from death. The Indians had by this time come very near, so that they riddled the wagon cover with bullets and arrows, one passing through the sleeve of the child's dress in its mother's arms, but doing it no personal injury. The terrified man kept the Indians at bay with his revolver, and finally they left him and rode furiously back to the scene of the murder of our train. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My husband's escape. Burial of the dead. Arrival of the survivors at Deer Creek. An ill-timed ball. When the Indians fired their fatal volley into the midst of our little company, while yet they were preparing to entertain them with a hospitable supper, my husband was some distance from the scene of horror. But, startled by the unexpected report, he hurriedly glanced around, saw the pale, terror-stricken faces of his wife and child, and the fall of Reverend Mr. Sharp from the wagon, while in the act of reaching for sugar and other articles of food with which to conciliate our savage guests. The hopelessness of the situation struck a chill to his heart. Having laid down his gun to assist in the preparation of the feast, the utter futility of contending single-handed against such a host of infuriated demons was too apparent. His only hope, and that a slight one indeed, was that the Indians might spare the lives of his wife and child to obtain a ransom. In this hope he resolved upon efforts for the preservation of his own life, that he might afterward put forth efforts for our rescue, either by pursuit and strategy or by purchase. He was shot at, and the barbed arrows whizzed past him, some passing through his clothing. He saw Mr. Wakefield fall, and knew that he was wounded, if not killed. Mr. Larimer passed him in his flight for life toward some neighboring timber. Mr. Kelly then ran for some tall grass and sagebrush, where he concealed himself, favored by the fast approaching darkness. Scarcely daring to breathe, his mind tortured with agonizing fears for the fate of his wife and child, he seemed to hear from them the cry for help, and at one time resolved to rush to their rescue, or die with them. Any fate seemed better than such torturing doubt. But, realizing at last the utter hopelessness of an attempt at rescue, and knowing that it was a custom of the Indians, sometimes, to spare the lives of white women and children taken captive, for ransom, he again resolved, if possible, to save his own life, that he might devote all his energies, and the remnant of fortune the savages had not despoiled him of, to the accomplishment of the rescue of his wife and child. Lying in his perilous shelter, he saw darkness creep slowly around the hills, closing on the scene of murder and devastation, like a curtain of mercy dropped to shut out a hideous sight. He heard the noise of breaking and crashing boxes, and the voices of the Indians calling to each other. Then came the culmination of his awful suspense. The Indians had again mounted their horses, and, raising the terrible war song, chanted its ominous notes as they took their way across the hills, carrying his yearning thoughts with them. Pen is powerless to portray the agony, to him, of those fearful moments. Still fearing to move in the darkness, he distinguished footsteps near him, and knew by the stealthy tread that they were those of an Indian. In breathless silence he crouched close to the ground, fearing each instant the descent of the tomahawk and the gleam of the scalping knife, when, strange to say, a venomous reptile came to his rescue, and his enemy fled before it. A huge rattlesnake, one of the many with which that region is infested, raised its curved neck close beside him, and, thrusting forth its poisonous fangs, gave a warning rattle. The prowling Indian took alarm at the sound. Other snakes, roused for the safety of their young in the dens around, repeated it, and the savage, knowing it would be death to venture further, retreated, leaving my husband in safety where he had taken refuge. For, although he must have lain close to the noisome reptile, he received no hurt, and the greater horror of his human foe rendered him almost indifferent to the dangers of his surroundings. Cautiously he crawled out of the weeds and grass, and, rising to his feet unharmed, started swiftly in an eastward direction. He had to go far out in the hills to avoid the savages, and, after traveling many miles around, he at last reached the large train, with which the small party I had seen pursued had previously taken refuge. They were already consolidating with other trains for defense, and would not venture to join Mr. Kelly, although he earnestly implored assistance to go out in aid of his friends and family, if any of them should be left alive. The colored man, Andy, soon after joined them. He came in running and in great excitement, and was about to report all the company killed, when he joyfully discovered Mr. Kelly. Great consternation and alarm had spread with the tidings of the massacre, and fears for personal safety prevented any one from joining my unhappy husband in efforts to rescue his wife and child, or succor his missing companions. The train did not move forward until reinforced by many others along the road, and even then every precaution was taken to secure safety and prevent a surprise. Women in many instances drove the teams, to prevent their husbands or fathers being taken at a disadvantage. Weapons were in every man's hands, and vigilant eyes were fixed on every bluff or gorge, anticipating attack. A little time and travel brought them to the first scene of murder, where they found the dead body of the companion of the man who so narrowly escaped with his family. They placed the body in a wagon, and proceeded to the dreaded spot where the slaughter of our party had occurred. The wagons still were standing, and feathers, flour, the remnants of much that was but half destroyed, lay scattered on the ground. Mr. Kelly, with faltering steps, supported by the strong arm of Andy, was among the first to search the spot. His intense distress for the unknown fate of his family urged him on, although he dreaded to think of what the bloody spot might disclose to him. The dead bodies of Mr. Sharp, Mr. Taylor, and our colored servant Franklin were discovered lying where they had fallen. Poor Frank had been shot by an arrow that pierced both his legs, pinning them together, in which condition he had been murdered by the ruthless wretches by having his skull broken. Both Mr. Sharp and Mr. Taylor left large families at home to mourn their loss. Mr. Larimer came up with an arrow wound in one of his limbs. He had passed the night in trying to elude his savage pursuers, and was very tired and exhausted, and very much distressed about his wife and son, a robust little fellow of 8 or 9 years. But Mr. Wakefield was nowhere to be seen. After searching the brushwood for some time, and a quarter of a mile distant from the scene of attack, they discovered him still alive, but pierced by 3 arrows that he had vainly endeavored to extract, succeeding only in withdrawing the shafts, but leaving the steel points still deeply embedded in his flesh. Mr. Kelly took him and cared for him with all the skill and kindness possible. No brothers could have been more tenderly attached to each other than they. He then procured as comfortable a conveyance as he could for them, and picked up a few relics from our demolished train. Among them was a daily journal of our trip, from the time we were married until the hour that the Indians came upon us. This he prized, as he said, more than he did his life. The next thing that was necessary to do, after the wounded were cared for, was to bury the dead, and a wide grave was dug and the 4 bodies solemnly consigned, uncoffined, to the earth. A buffalo robe was placed above them, and then the earth was piled on their unconscious breasts. At that time the question of color had occasioned much dissension, and controversy ran high as to the propriety of allowing the colored people the privilege of sitting beside their white brethren. Poor Franklin had shared death with our companions, and was not deemed unworthy to share the common grave of his fellow victims. They lie together in the valley of Little Box Elder, where with saddened hearts our friends left them, thinking of the high hopes and fearless energy with which they had started on their journey, each feeling secure in the success that awaited them, and never, for a moment, dreaming of the grave in the wilderness that was to close over them and their earthly hopes. They were buried on the desolate plain, 1,000 miles away from their loved ones and children, who bemoan their sad, untimely fate. Mr. Kelly found part of his herd of cattle grazing nearby. Mr. Sharp's were still tied to the stake where he had carefully secured them. The Indians had taken our horses, but left the cattle, as they do when they are on the warpath, or unless they need meat for present use. They shot some of them, however, and left them to decay upon the plain. Many arrows were scattered upon the ground, their peculiar marks showing that their owners had all belonged to one tribe, though of different bands. They were similar in form and finish. Their shafts were round and 3 feet long, grooved on their sides, that the blood of the victim might not be impeded in its outward flow. Each had 3 strips of feathers attached to its top, about 7 inches in length, and on the other end a steel point, fastened lightly, so as to be easily detached in the flesh it penetrates. The depth of the wound depends on the distance of the aim, but they sometimes pass quite through the body, though usually their force is exhausted in entering a few inches beyond the point. The wounded being made as comfortable as circumstances would allow, the train left the spot in the evening, and moved forward to an encampment a mile distant from the sad place where the journey of our lost companions had ended forever, whose visions of the golden land must be a higher and brighter one than earthly eyes can claim. Early next day the travelers arrived at Deer Creek Fort, where Mr. Kelly found medical aid for the wounded, and procured a tent to shelter them, and devoted himself to alleviating their sufferings, and, with the assistance of the kind people of the fort, succeeded in arranging them in tolerable comfort. Captain Reinhardt was commanding officer at Deer Creek, and ordered the property of the deceased to be delivered over to him, which Mr. Kelly did. The story of the attack and massacre had traveled faster than the sufferers from its barbarity. The garrison had learned it before the train arrived, through some soldiers returning from Fort Laramie, where they had been to receive money from the paymaster, who had heard an account of the attack on the road, and had a passing glimpse of the terrible field of slaughter. The evening that the large train arrived at the fort, the officers gave a ball, and the emigrant women were invited, from the trains camped in the vicinity, to join in these inappropriately timed festivities. The mother of the child who had so narrowly escaped death, having lost her own wardrobe in her efforts to escape the pursuit of the Indians, borrowed a dress from a lady who resided at the fort, and attended the entertainment, dancing and joining in the gaieties, when the burial of their companion and our poor men had just been completed, and the heavy cloud of our calamity had so lately shrouded them in gloom. Such are the effects of isolation from social and civil influence, and contact with danger, and familiarity with terror and death. People grow reckless, and often lose the gentle sympathies that alleviate suffering, from infrequent intercourse with it in its worst forms. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians, by Fanny Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Beginning of My Captivity. The facts related in the preceding chapter concerning matters occurring in Mr. Kelly's experience and adventures after the attack upon our train were related to me after my restoration to freedom and my husband by him. I now return to the narration of my own terrible experiences. I was led a short distance from the train, with Mary, and told to remain quiet, and tried to submit. But oh, what a yearning sprang up in my heart to escape, as I hoped my husband had done. But many watchful eyes were upon me, and enemies on every side, and I realized that any effort then at escape would result in failure, and probably cause the death of all the prisoners. Mrs. Larimer and her boy came to us, trembling with fear, saying, "The men have all escaped and left us to the mercy of the savages." In reply, I said, "I do hope they have. What benefit would it be to us to have them here, to suffer this fear and danger with us? They would be killed, and then all hope of rescue for us would be at an end." Her agitation was extreme. Her grief seemed to have reached its climax when she saw the Indians destroying her property, which consisted principally of such articles as belonged to the daguerrean art. She had indulged in high hopes of fortune from the prosecution of this art among the mining towns of Idaho. As she saw her chemicals, picture cases, and other property pertaining to her calling being destroyed, she uttered such a wild despairing cry as brought the chief of the band to us, who, with gleaming knife, threatened to end all her further troubles in this world. The moment was a critical one for her. The Indians were flushed with an easy won victory over a weak party. They had tasted blood, and it needed but slight provocation for them to shed that even of defenseless women and children. My own agony could be no less than that of my companion in misfortune. The loss of our worldly possessions, which were not inconsiderable, consisting of a large herd of cattle and groceries and goods of particular value in the mining regions, I gave no thought to. The possible fate of my husband, the dark, fearful future that loomed before myself and little Mary, for whose possible future I had more apprehension than for my own, were thoughts that flashed through my mind to the exclusion of all mere pecuniary considerations. But my poor companion was in great danger, and perhaps it was a selfish thought of future loneliness in captivity which induced me to intercede that her life might be spared. I went to the side of the chief, and, assuming a cheerfulness I was very far from feeling, pled successfully for her life. I endeavored in every way to propitiate our savage captor, but received no evidence of kindness or relenting that I could then understand. He did present me, however, a wreath of gay feathers from his own head, which I took, regarding it merely as an ornament, when in reality, as I afterward learned, it was a token of his favor and protection. He then left us, to secure his own share of plunder, but we saw that we were surrounded by a special guard of armed men, and so gave up all struggle against what seemed an inevitable doom, and sat down upon the ground in despair. I know now that night had come upon us while we sat there, and that darkness was closing the scene of desolation and death before their arrangements for departure were completed. The first intimation we had that our immediate massacre was not intended, was a few articles of clothing presented by a young Indian, whose name was Wechela, who intimated that we would have need for them. It was a pitiable sight to see the terrified looks of our helpless children, who clung to us for the protection we could not give. Mrs. Larimer was unconscious of the death of any of our party. I did not tell her what my eyes had seen, fearing that she could not endure it, but strove to encourage and enliven her, lest her excitement should hasten her death or excite the anger of our captors. We both feared that when the Indians made their arrangements for departure, we would be quickly disposed of by the scalping knife, or even should we escape for the time, we saw no prospect of release from bondage. Terror of the most appalling nature for the fate of the children possessed me, and all the horrors of Indian captivity that we had ever heard crowded on our minds with a new and fearful meaning. The slow fires, the pitiless knife, the poisoned arrows, the torture of famine, and 1,000 nameless phantoms of agony passed before our troubled souls, filling us with fears so harrowing that the pangs of dissolution compared to them must have been relief. It may be thought almost impossible in such a chaos of dread to collect the soul in prayer, but when woe is come, the soul is dumb, that crieth not to God, and the only respite we could claim from despair was the lifting of our trembling hearts upward to the God of mercy. Those hours of misery can never be forgotten. We were oppressed by terrors we could not explain or realize. The sudden separation from those we loved and relied on, our own helplessness, and the gloom of uncertainty that hung over our future, surely none can better testify to the worth of trust in God than those whose hope on earth seemed ended, and, faint and weak as our faith was, it saved us from utter desolation and the blackness of despair. From among the confused mass of material of all kinds scattered about, the same young Indian, Wechela, brought me a pair of shoes, also a pair of little Mary's. He looked kindly as he laid these articles before me, intimating by his gestures that our lives were to be spared, and that we should have need of them and other clothing during our long march into captivity. He also brought me some books and letters, all of which I thankfully received. I readily conceived a plan to make good use of them, and secreted as many as I could about my clothing. I said to Mrs. Larimer, "If I can retain these papers and letters, and we are forced to travel with the Indians into their unknown country, I shall drop them at intervals along the way we are taken, as a guide, and trust in God that our friends may find and follow them to our rescue, or if an opportunity of escape offer, we will seize it, and by their help retrace our steps." The property that the Indians could not carry with them, they gathered into a pile and lighted. The light of the flames showed us the forms of our captors busily loading their horses and ours with plunder, and preparing to depart. When their arrangements were completed, they came to us and signified that we must accompany them, pointing to the horses they led up to us, and motioning us to mount. The horse assigned to me was one that had belonged to Mr. Larimer, and was crippled in the back. This I endeavored to make them understand, but failed. This was the first reliable assurance they gave us that our lives were not in immediate danger, and we received it gratefully, for with the prospect of life, hope revived, and faith to believe that God had not forsaken us, and that we might yet be united to our friends, who never seemed dearer than when we were about to be carried into captivity by the hostile sons of the forest. Many persons have since assured me that, to them, Death would have been preferable to life with such prospects, saying that rather than have submitted to be carried away by savages to a dark and doubtful doom, they would have taken their own lives. But it is only those who have looked over the dark abyss of death who know how the soul shrinks from meeting the unknown future. Experience is a grand teacher, and we were then in her school, and learned that while hope offers the faintest token of refuge, we pause upon the fearful brink of eternity, and look back for rescue. Mrs. Larimer had climbed into her saddle, her boy placed behind her on the same horse, and started on, accompanied by a party of Indians. I also climbed onto my saddle, but was no sooner there when the horse fell to the ground, and I under him, thus increasing the bruises I had already received, and causing me great pain. This accident detained me some time in the rear. A dread of being separated from the only white woman in that awful wilderness filled me with horror. Soon they had another horse saddled for me, and assisted me to mount him. I looked around for my little Mary. There she stood, a poor helpless lamb, in the midst of bloodthirsty savages. I stretched out my arms for her imploringly. For a moment they hesitated. Then, to my unspeakable joy, they yielded, and gave me my child. They then started on, leading my horse. They also gave me a rope that was fastened around the horse's underjaw. The air was cool, and the sky was bright with the glitter of starlight. The water, as it fell over the rocks in the distance, came to our eager ears with a faint, pleasant murmur. All nature seemed peaceful and pitiless in this calm repose, unconscious of our desolate misery. The cry of night birds and chirp of insects came with painful distinctness as we turned to leave the valley of the little box elder. Straining my eyes, I sought to penetrate the shadows of the woods where our fugitive friends might be hid. The smoldering ruins of our property fell into ashes, and the smoke faded away. Night had covered the traces of confusion and struggle with her shrouding mantle, and all seemed quiet and unbroken peace. I turned for a last look, and even the smoke was gone. The solemn trees, the rippling water, the soft night wind, and the starlight, told no tale of the desolation and death that had gone before, and I rode on in my helpless condition, with my child clinging to me, without guide or support, save my trust in God. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Plan for little Mary's escape. Tortures of uncertainty. Unsuccessful attempt to escape. The Indians left the scene of their cruel rapacity, traveling northward, chanting their monotonous war song. After a ride of 2 miles through tall weeds and bushes, we left the bottom lands and ascended some bluffs, and soon after came to a creek which was easily forded, and where the Indians quenched their thirst. The hills beyond began to be more difficult to ascend, and the gorges seemed fearfully deep, as we looked into the black shadows unrelieved by the feeble light of the stars. In the darkness of our ride, I conceived a plan for the escape of little Mary. I whispered in her childish ear, "Mary, we are only a few miles from our camp, and the stream we have crossed you can easily wade through. I have dropped letters on the way, you know, to guide our friends in the direction we have taken. They will guide you back again, and it may be your only chance of escape from destruction. Drop gently down and lie on the ground for a little while to avoid being seen. Then retrace your steps, and may God in mercy go with you. If I can, I will follow you." The child, whose judgment was remarkable for her age, readily acceded to this plan. Her eye brightened, and her young heart throbbed as she thought of its success. Watching the opportunity, I dropped her gently, carefully, and unobserved to the ground, and she lay there while the Indians pursued their way, unconscious of their loss. To portray my feelings upon this separation would be impossible. The agony I suffered was indescribable. I was firmly convinced that my course was wise, that I had given her the only chance of escape within my power, yet the terrible uncertainty of what her fate might be in the way before her was almost unbearable. I continued to think of it so deeply that at last I grew desperate, and resolved to follow her at every risk. Accordingly, watching an opportunity, I too slipped to the ground under the friendly cover of night, and the horse went on without its rider. My plan was not successful. My flight was soon discovered, and the Indian wheeled around and rode back in my pursuit. Crouching in the undergrowth, I might have escaped in the darkness, were it not for their cunning. Forming in a line of 40 or 50 abreast, they actually covered the ground as they rode past me. The horses themselves were thus led to betray me, for, being frightened at my crouching form, they stopped and reared, thus informing them of my hiding place. With great presence of mind I arose the moment I found myself discovered, and, relating my story, the invention of an instant, I succeeded partly in allaying their anger. I told them the child had fallen asleep and dropped from the horse, that I had endeavored to call their attention to it, but in vain, and, fearing I would be unable to find her if we rode further, I had jumped down and attempted the search alone. The Indians used great violence toward me, assuring me that if any further attempts were made to escape, my punishment would be accordingly. They then promised to send a party out in search of the child when it became light. Poor little Mary, alone in the darkness, a little helpless child, who can portray her terror? With faith to trust and courage to dare, that little trembling form through the long hours of the night kept watch. The lonely cry of the night-bird had no fear in its melancholy scream for the little wanderer who crouched amid the prairie grass. The baying of the gray wolf, as he passed the lonely watcher, might startle, but could not drive the faith from her heart. Surely God is just, and angels will guide the faltering feet to friends and home. Innocent of wrong, how could she but trust that the unseen hands of spirits would guide her from the surrounding perils? End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Continuation of our march into the wilderness. Suffering from thirst and weariness. Disappearance of my fellow prisoner. Loss of the old chief's pipe and its consequences to me. A scene of terror. To take up the thread of my own narrative again, and the continuation of my journey with the savages, after the never-to-be-forgotten night when I parted from little Mary and the attempt to save myself, will be to entertain my reader with a sight of the dangerous and precipitous paths among the great bluffs which we had been approaching, and the dizzy, fearful heights leading over the dark abyss, or the gloomy, terrible gorge, where only an Indian dares to venture. The blackness of night and the dread of our savage companions added terror to this perilous ride. As we passed the little creek before we plunged into these rocky fastnesses, we had left some scattered woods along its banks. I remember looking longingly at the dim shelter of those friendly trees, and being possessed by an almost uncontrollable desire to leap from the horse and dare my fate in endeavoring to reach their protecting shade. But the Indians' rifles behind me, and my dread of instant death, restrained me. And now my attention was attracted by the wild and terrible scenery around us, through which our fearful captors rode at ease, although it seemed impossible for man or beast to retain a footing over such craggy peaks and through such rugged ravines. The cool air and the sound of rippling water warned us of our nearness to a river, and soon the savages turned their horses down a deep declivity that, like a mighty wall, closed in the great bed of the North Platte. I saw that the river was rapid and deep, but we crossed the sands, plunged in, and braved the current. From the child to my husband was an easy transition. Indeed, when I thought of one, the other was present in my mind, and to mark the path of our retreat with the letters and papers I dropped on our way seemed the only hope I had of his being able to come to my rescue. As the horses plunged into the swelling river, I secretly dropped another letter, that, I prayed, might be a clue to the labyrinth through which we were being led, for I could see by all the Indians' precautions that to mislead any who should have the temerity to attempt our recovery was the design of their movements. They had taken paths inaccessible to white men, and made their crossing at a point where it would be impossible for trains to pass, so that they might avoid meeting emigrants. Having reached the opposite bank, they separated into squads, and started in every direction except southward, so as to mislead or confuse pursuers by the various trails. The band that surrounded and directed us kept to the northward a little by west. I tried to keep the points of compass clearly, because it seemed part of the hope that sustained me. Mr. Kelly had said that our position on the Little Box Elder was about 12 miles from Deer Creek Station, which lay to the northwest of us. Marking our present course, I tried, by calculating the distance, to keep that position in my mind, for toward it my yearning desire for help and relief turned. After crossing the river and issuing from the bluffs, we came to a bright, cool stream of water in a lovely valley which ran through its bosom, spreading a delicious freshness all around. Brilliant flowers opened their gorgeous cups to the coming sunshine, and delicate blossoms hid themselves among the rich shrubbery and at the mossy roots of grand old trees. The awakening birds soared upward with loud and joyful melodies, and nature rejoiced at approaching day. The beauty and loveliness of the scene mocked my sleepless eyes, and despair tugged at my heartstrings. Still I made superhuman efforts to appear cheerful, for my only refuge was in being submissive and practicing conciliation. My fear of them was too powerful to allow me to give way to emotion for one moment. There were sentinels stationed at different places to give the alarm, in case of any one approaching to rescue, and I afterward learned that in such a case I would have been instantly murdered. Next morning I learned by signs that Indians had gone out in search of little Mary, scattering themselves over the hills in squads. Those remaining were constantly overlooking their plunder and unrolling bundles taken from our wagons. They indulged their admiration for their spoils in loud conversation. The Indians seemed to select, with a clear knowledge of natural beauty, such localities as seemed best fitted to suggest refreshment and repose. The scenery through which we had passed was wildly grand. It now became serenely beautiful, and to a lover of nature, with a mind free from fear and anxiety, the whole picture would have been a dream of delight. The night of my capture I was ordered to lie down on the ground, near a wounded Indian. A circle of them guarded me, and 3 fierce warriors sat near me with drawn tomahawks. Reader, imagine my feelings after the terrible scenes of the day previous. The desolate white woman in the power of revengeful savages, not daring to speak, lest their fury should fall on my defenseless head. My great anxiety now was to preserve my sanity, which threatened to be overcome if I did not arouse myself to hope and put aside the feeling of despair which at times stole over me. My heart was continually lifted to Our Father, and confidently I now began to feel that prayer would be answered, and that God would deliver me in due season. This nerved me to endure and appear submissive. At early dawn I was aroused from my apparent slumbers by the war chief, who sent me out to catch our horses, our American horses being afraid of the savages, and as the animals were those belonging to our train, it was supposed that I could do so readily. Upon turning, my eyes were gladdened by the sight of my fellow prisoner, who was seated with her boy upon the ground, eating buffalo meat and crackers. I went immediately to her, and we conversed in low tones, telling her of my intention to escape the first opportunity. She seemed much depressed, but I endeavored to reassure her, and bidding her hope for the best, went back to where the Indians were making ropes, and packing their goods and plunder more securely, preparatory to the succeeding march, which was commenced at an early hour of the day. We proceeded on our journey until near noon, when we halted in a valley not far to the north of Deer Creek Station, and I met this lady again. It was a clear and beautiful valley where we rested until the scorching rays of the sun had faded in the horizon. Being burdened with the gun and bow and arrow of the chief, my tired arms were relieved, and I pled for the privilege of camping here all night for many reasons. One was, we might be overtaken by friends sent to rescue us, and the distance of return would be less if I should be successful in my next attempt to escape. My entreaties were unavailing. The savages were determined to go forward, and we were soon mounted and started on. We traveled until sunset, then camped for the night in a secluded valley. We seemed to enter this valley along the base of a wall composed of bluffs or peaks. Within these circling hills it lay, a green, cool resting place, watered by a bright, sparkling stream, and pleasantly dotted with bushes and undergrowth. The moon went down early, and in the dim, uncertain starlight, the heavy bluffs seemed to shut us in on all sides, rising grimly like guardians over our imprisoned lines. Blankets were spread, and on these the Indians rested. I was then led out some distance in the camp, and securely fastened for the night. But before this, I remarked to my fellow prisoner my determination to escape that night, if my life were the forfeit, as in every wind I fancied I could hear the voice of little Mary calling me. She entreated me not to leave her, but promising help to her should I be fortunate enough to get free, I sadly bade her good night, and went to my allotted place. In the morning, when permitted to rise, I learned that she had disappeared. A terrible sense of isolation closed around me. No one can realize the sensation without in some measure experiencing it. I was desolate before, but now that I knew myself separated from my only white companion, the feeling increased tenfold, and seemed to weigh me down with its awful gloomy horror. In the heart of the wilderness, surrounded by creatures with whom no chord of sympathy was entertained, far from home, friends, and the interests of civilized life, the attractions of society, and, above all, separated from husband and loved ones, there seemed but one glimpse of light in all the darkness of despair left, and that was flight. I listened to every sound, while moments appeared hours, and it seemed to me that death in its most terrible form would not be so hard to bear as the torturing agony I then endured. I murmured broken prayers. I seemed to hear the voices of my husband and child calling me, and, springing forward with a wild belief that it was real, would sink back again, overwhelmed with fresh agony. Arrangements were then made for resuming our journey, and we were soon once more on our march. Another burden had been added to my almost worn-out frame, the leading of an unruly horse, and my arms were so full of the implements I was forced to carry, that I threw away the pipe of the old chief, a tube nearly 3 feet long, and given me to take care of, which was very unfortunate for me, exciting the wrath and anger of the chief to a terrible degree. Now they seemed to regard me with a suspicious aversion, and were not so kind as before. The country they passed over was high, dry, and barren. I rode one horse and led another, and when evening came they stopped to rest in a grove of great timber, where there was a dry creek bed. Water was obtained by digging in the sand, but the supply was meager, and I was allowed none. The sun began to sink, and the chief was so enraged against me that he told me by signs that I should behold it rise no more. Grinding his teeth with wrathful anger, he made me understand that I was not to be trusted, had once tried to escape, had made them suffer the loss of my child, and that my life would be the forfeit. A large fire had been built, and they all danced around it. Night had begun to darken heavily over me, and I stood trembling and horror-struck, not knowing but that the flame the savages capered about was destined to consume my tortured form. The pipe of the chief was nowhere to be found, and it was demanded of me to produce it. He used the Indian words chapa chanopa, uttered in a voice of thunder, accompanying them with gestures whose meaning was too threatening to be mistaken. I looked in fear and dismay around me, utterly at a loss to know what was expected, yet dreading the consequences of failing to obey. Wechela, the Indian boy, who had been so kind to me, now came up, and made the motion of puffing with his lips, to help me, and then I remembered that I had broken the pipe the day before, and thrown it away, ignorant of their veneration for the pipe, and of its value as a peace offering. The chief declared that I should die for having caused the loss of his pipe. An untamed horse was brought, and they told me I would be placed on it as a target for their deadliest arrows, and the animal might then run at will, carrying my body wherever it would. Helpless, and almost dying with terror at my situation, I sank on a rocky seat in their midst. They were all armed, and anxiously awaited the signal. They had pistols, bows, and spears, and I noticed some stoop and raise blazing firebrands to frighten the pawing beast that was to bear me to death. In speechless agony I raised my soul to God. Soon it would stand before his throne, and with all the pleading passion of my sinking soul I prayed for pardon and favor in his precious blood, who had suffered for my sins, and risen on high for my justification. In an instant a lifeline of thought condensed itself into my mind, and I could see my old home and hear my mother's voice; and the contrast between the love I had been so ruthlessly torn from, and the hundreds of savage faces gleaming with ferocity and excitement around me, seemed like the lights and shadows of some weird picture. But I was to die, and I desired, with all the strength of my soul, to grasp the promises of God's mercy, and free my parting spirit from all revengeful, earthly thoughts. In what I almost felt my final breath, I prayed for my own salvation, and the forgiveness of my enemies; and remembering a purse of money which was in my pocket, knowing that it would decay with my body in the wilderness, I drew it out, and, with suffused eyes, divided it among them, though my hands were growing powerless and my sight failing. $120 in notes I gave them, telling them its value as I did so, when, to my astonishment, a change came over their faces. They laid their weapons on the ground, seemingly pleased, and anxious to understand, requesting me to explain the worth of each note clearly, by holding up my fingers. Eagerly I tried to obey, perceiving the hope their milder manner held out; but my cold hands fell powerless by my side, my tongue refused to utter a sound, and, unconsciously, I sank to the ground, utterly insensible to objects around me. When insensibility gave way to returning feeling, I was still on the ground where I had fallen, but preparations for the deadly scene were gone, and the savages slumbered on the ground near me, by the faint firelight. Crawling into a sitting posture, I surveyed the camp, and saw hundreds of sleeping forms lying in groups around, with watches set in their places, and no opportunity to escape, even if strength permitted. Weak and trembling, I sat down, and lay silent until daybreak, when the camp was again put in motion, and, at their bidding, I mounted one horse and led another, as I had done on the day previous. This was no easy task, for the pack horse, which had not been broken, would frequently pull back so violently as to bring me to the ground, at which the chief would become fearfully angry, threatening to kill me at once. Practicing great caution, and using strong effort, I would strive to remain in the saddle to avoid the cuffs and blows received. Whenever the bridle would slip inadvertently from my hand, the chief's blasphemous language would all be English, a sad commentary on the benefits white men confer on their savage brethren when brought into close contact. Drunkenness, profanity, and dissolute habits are the lessons of civilization to the red men, and when the weapons we furnish are turned against ourselves, their edge is keen indeed. Feeling that I had forfeited the good will of the Indians, and knowing that the tenure of my life was most uncertain, I dared make no complaint, although hunger and devouring thirst tortured me. The way still led through dry and sandy hills, upon which the sun glared down with exhausting heat, and seemed to scorch life and moisture out of all his rays fell upon. As far as my eye could reach, nothing but burning sand and withering sagebrush or thorny cactus was to be seen. All my surroundings only served to aggravate the thirst which the terrible heat of that long day's ride increased to frenzy. When, in famishing despair, I closed my eyes, a cup of cool, delicious drink would seem to be presented to my lips, only to be cruelly withdrawn; and this torture seemed to me like the agony of the rich man, who besought Lazarus for one drop of water to cool his parched tongue. I thought of all I had been separated from, as it seemed to me, forever, and the torment of the hour reduced me to despair. I wished to die, feeling that the pangs of dissolution would not surpass the anguish of my living death. My voice was almost gone, and with difficulty I maintained my seat in the saddle. Turning my eyes despairingly to my captors, I uttered the word Minna, signifying water in their language, and kept repeating it imploringly at intervals. They seemed to hurry forward, and, just at sunset, came in sight of a grassy valley through which flowed a river, and the sight of it came like hope to my almost dying eyes. A little brook from the hills above found its way into the waters of this greater stream,